So today it's outcome harvesting, and Michelle will talk about adding attitude change to the harvest, and we'll touch on other fertile areas for bricolage as well. But first things first, who are we, your presenters? I'm Jeph. I'm an Indian New Zealander, an independent consultant in design, monitoring and evaluation. And among my past avatars were emergency doctor, stained glass artist, and I was once a crocodile trapper in the Brazilian Amazon. I loved all those things, and I love evaluating for now at least. Let's see what else there is in store. Michelle, tell us about you. Thank you, Michelle. Great. Okay, and let's not forget Nick, who's quietly in the background, flicking all the buttons and doing the stuff. Thanks, Nick. Right, I'm going to share my screen and we'll crack into it. Okay, today we've just done our welcome and introductions. I'm going to do an overview of outcome harvesting, and it's not a method overview where you're going to walk out of here knowing how to outcome harvest if you haven't before. It's a conceptual overview. What are the ideas in there? What are the key concepts in which we might bricolage? Michelle is then going to talk about attitude change in outcome harvesting, why and how we might want to add attitudes to the outcomes we harvest. And then there'll be a space for questions after each of those. That's the kind of body of the webinar. And then we've got outcome harvesting with realist evaluation, outcome harvesting with most significant change, and then outcome harvesting as a participatory method. It's kind of bricolaging the process rather than the concepts. And then we'll leap into a bit of a discussion and see where we've got to. So that's where we are. And I thought we'd just start off with just talking about evaluation itself. And of course, there's many definitions of evaluation, but I just use this image. I'm a very visual person. Evaluation came from a place of thinking, we can figure out what are the cogwheels in the system, what makes a system tick or not tick, and if we're working with a change agent, which cogwheel or which wheels are they manipulating? Are they changing the size off or the gearing off or whatever? And we can figure out what difference they've made to their wheel, and then what difference does that make to the overall, what time the clock's telling or how well it tells the time. So the kind of impact. We can focus on a small piece of it and we can gather data on that. And then with that, we can answer bigger questions about what the significance of that is. It is a caricature. It's one caricature of evaluation. I know there's many others. But what if your clock looks like this and it's not cogwheels, but it's kind of people and all their messy complexity, and they do interact with each other and lock teeth, but they do it in messy, ill-defined ways. Or maybe your clock may be something like this or this. Maybe it's a bunch of Muslim people walking down the street like this. There's your clock. Maybe it's this. So suddenly we've got a much more complex context that we're evaluating. We're not evaluating simple, defined, scientifically meshed cogs of a wheel. We're evaluating humans in their complex systems. And again, as a caricature, I've put down the left a standard intervention evaluation that's looking at a cogwheel. You'd ask, is the change that we intended, is that happening? You might design it using the theory of change. and what the key variables are, and define key variables from that theory of change. And you'd measure the intervention process. What do they do, and how well do they do it? What happened? And you might add a little bit about the context and assumptions. This slide, by the way, comes from the Causal Pathways initiative, of which I'm part of, and I delivered this in a webinar for Causal Pathways, and it's a great slide. And then you say, well, do the findings align with the theory of change? Yes, they do. Therefore, the theory of change must be correct. And so the theory of change is used to infer what's going on, your predefined knowledge of how the system works. But in the complex kind of systems that I showed you that are not clocks but full of people, the question isn't is what we expected happening. The question is what is happening, and how and why is that happening? Because we don't really know. And we can't really just depend on a theory of change, because there's no theory of change that tells you, even with your own child, what your own child is going to do. Your own child is a complex human being. And I can tell you, if you do this, they'll do that, and I'll be wrong. A child will always do something else, let alone any project we're involved in. So we have to consider complexity, and we have to look for what causes change outside of the little theory of change box that we had. And if you go down to the bottom, what you need is empirical evidence. Bottom right there is not a theory of change, but you actually say, let's gather the empirical evidence. That's what will tell us how the system works and what changes. So, and this is a picture of David Snowden, who's a world guru of complexity, and a wonderful video he has. I just took a screenshot of it. He says, change is about managing the emergence of beneficial coherence within boundaries and attractors and boundaries. And in that simple phrase, he says, and it's anything but simple, his phrase, but he was just joking. So let's unpack what this means, beneficial coherence. So there you have on the left a picture from 1893 of the first women in the world to vote. And Outcome Mapping Learning Community is running a competition. The first person who can answer in the chat which country this is in that the first women in the world voted gets an all expenses paid trip to Sri Lanka to attend the learning lab. So throw your answers in the chat. But I think all of us will agree that a system in which 100% of the people vote rather than 50% of the people is beneficial. It's better for the men of that society as well as the women. It's a system that's taken itself apart from being male dominated and slowly putting itself back together. I know there's still discrimination against women in nearly every country in the world, but slowly putting it back together in a new conformation that's beneficial for everyone involved. And on the right, that process continuing where a black woman in South Africa voting in post-apartheid South Africa. Nick, are there any takers on the any correct answers in the chat for the prize question?
No comments so far.
No, well, the answer, I'm proud to tell you, is New Zealand. But it was only 1893 where the first women in the world voted. So yeah, 130 years ago. And it was in New Zealand. Isn't that amazing? That for the rest of human history, we thought it was normal not to have anyone who was a woman voting. Anyway, back. So the question then for an evaluation is, isn't what happened and what did the project do? The question becomes, how can we tell if a social system became unstuck and reformed itself in a different conformation? And how did that happen? I.e., was beneficial coherence facilitated? And that applies to, obviously, women voting in the world, but it also applies to minorities being included in an education system, or gender inclusive development, or new farming techniques. It's that question: does the social system formed in a new concept and a new conformation? That is common to them all. Enter outcome harvesting. This was from an outcome harvest I did in Afghanistan, and the women who did their system map had to put this in the corner, and those blocks, those human figures are carrying, say, behavior, policy, relationship in Arabic, relationship, and the one on the ground, attitude. So the kind of four pillars, and we'll talk about attitude later with Michelle. So here comes a quick conceptual overview of outcome harvesting. Whoops. An image of a harvest might be something like that, wheat fields in North America done in straight lines but my image of outcome harvesting is much more like this, a woman who's in the Indian Himalayas who harvests, and it's very human, and it's a little bit messy, and it's organic. So that's my icon of outcome harvesting. That's what the harvest is about. And we're talking conceptually, remember, two core principles of outcome harvesting. One is it's outcome centered, and I'll unpack what that means. And the second is that it uses reverse logic, and I'll unpack that too. So what is normal logic says when you do an evaluation, you say, what did the project do? What happened? What's the output? What's the impact of that? And then you might start considering that that's all nested in a context and there's other stuff going on. But basically, you're focused on that causal chain there, activities to impact. And in fact, most evaluations of the traditional kind actually only focus on project activities and output, and they use their theory of change to infer impact. So that's what the normal logic is, left to right, A causes B causes C. A reverse logic says, let's start in the context. This is how you're thinking. This is, imagine being a detective. I was lucky enough to learn outcome harvesting with Ricardo Wilson Grau, who kind of invented it. And he described it as being like a detective or a pathologist or an anthropologist, find the evidence first and then work backwards to figure out where it came from. So you first think about the context, and then you say, what's going on in this context regarding girls' literacy in Somalia, whatever your question is. And then you work backwards and say, who are the key people and institutions involved in girls' literacy in Somalia? And how do they think, relate, behave, and make rules? And then you finally think about what's the project doing in that. And an outcome harvest accepts is this complex feedback between what people are doing and thinking, etc., and the context. And it works in both ways. The context works in people, and people work in the context. Within that, nested within that, outcome harvesting does accept as a causal chain from the project to people to impact, but it's much smaller than the overall messy, interrelated feedback loops going on in the context. But yes, there is that causal pathway going this way. And outcome harvesting focuses there, and pretty much only there. And I'll unpack for how this works. So that's the reverse logic. Starting at the context and working backwards, and then saying what's in the middle of this. Just as a detective might start overall with the context, etc., find some clues, and then say, who did these clues come from? Who has done what to cause these changes that I can see here? This lovely diagram of so that's reverse logic. Now we're talking about outcomes. This lovely diagram comes from another steward of the outcome mapping learning community, Mathias, who's brilliant with his simple art. So this is what Ricardo Wilson Grau would also say. An outcome should be who. You need to know which person or institution did or said what, or did or said or made policy, etc. What, when. There should be where in there, and with whom. So that's, you try to get a complete picture of what changed and what was around that change. And Mariam goes on to give us this diagram. If you can, you try to collect some contribution. What did the change agent we're working with do to enable or to contribute? It's not this contribution rather than attribution, but what did the change agent do to contribute to that to those outcomes? There are 6 formal steps in an outcome harvest, and I borrowed this slide from, you'll see it later in Michelle's presentation as well, just so you can see how the steps work differently. First, design the harvest. What are the questions we've got? And then, which actors' changes of behavior or policy or relationship would help us answer those questions? You then ask your change agent to define outcome statements, which are draft now. Michelle's used BC, behavior change statements, but the official term is outcome statements. So the change agent says, we think the government is now doing this, or we say that the government's now doing this, or people are now bringing their children to the hospital to get immunized. They just say that. They don't have to prove it. They say, this is what we think is happening. Step 3 says, let's engage and let's find if those things really are happening. So you may do interviews and engage with people. You may ask mothers, a group of mothers in a focus group, how many of you took your children to hospital? Why did you do that? When did you do that? Those kind of questions. You might go to hospital records. It's not just, it's mixed method. It may be qualitative, asking people. It may be quantitative. How many immunizations does the hospital give? You may want to say, how many cases of measles were there this year? You probably would do both. So somewhere between step 3 and step 4, you get and this is the harvesting, step 3 and step 4, real outcome statements with trying to triangulate them. What's around? Are these really plausible comments? Have we got enough to really believe this really did happen? Step 5, we try to get all your, like the woman carrying her bundle of wheat that I showed you right at the beginning. You try to get that whole bundle of outcome statements together and you analyze and interpret. And there are a number of different ways to do that. My preferred method is to do it with a bunch of people who really know what they're talking about. That may be the change agent, it may be local participants, it may be experts. So have a group sense-making session. But there are a number of different ways. But the key we're just talking conceptually here. The key concept is to analyze and interpret. And then step 6 is to support the use of findings. So then you say the kind of every evaluation should have it. What did we find, and then so what? So step 6 is a so what. What does this mean for the organisation we work with? We suggest you work more on education of young mothers, because there seems to be a significant hurdle to immunisation because of understanding of Western science, something like that. And just to give you a picture of how this all looks, this is an immunisation camp I did when I was working as a doctor with Doctors Without Borders in a really remote part of Colombia during their civil war. This is an indigenous village, and a typical evaluation would focus there where the circle is. It would focus on this alcohol swab and the baby's bottom, and how many needles were put appropriately into baby's bottoms, and down at the bottom is a chili bin. Was the cold chain appropriately kept? And the woman on the right, who's an MSF nurse, what's in her vaccination record, etc. That's the activity. That's the evaluation that's looking at the what. An outcome harvest wouldn't look so much at there. It would look at the Indigenous woman. How is it that she's exhibiting this new behaviour of bringing her baby to be immunised when her traditional culture says that putting a hole in a baby's skin lets the spirit leak out? How's this government nurse in the middle of a war visiting an Indigenous village for the first time in her life? New behaviour. What happened? What's that relationship like between nurse and Indigenous people? What's happened between the MSF nurse and the government nurse? And what about all these people here from the Indigenous village watching and for the first time in their life immunisation happening? What's going on there? So outcome harvesting, we said it's got a reverse logic, and you collect the outcomes first and then figure out how they happened. And the outcomes that you're collecting are visible changes in what people do, how they make their rules, and who they relate to. So that's what you're harvesting. And Michelle's going to add to that. But just to give you another diagram of how the whole thing works, along the bottom here, the x-axis is the typical results chain of a project, inputs to impacts. And on the y-axis, imagine it's how much control there is. So in terms of inputs, activities, and outputs, us, i.e. the change agent, has a huge amount of control. Even at the output level, a huge amount of control. But when it comes to outcomes, what other people do, what your participants do, we don't actually control it. We can't force women to come to immunise. We can't force drug addicts to stop using ketamine. If they stop using it, they're in control of that, not us. And therefore, we have relatively small contribution to make to the impact. Meanwhile, the actors we work with, they can't control much about our inputs, activities, and even our outputs. But when it comes to their behavior, that's where they have much higher control. And therefore, the people we work, this is outcome harvesting philosophy. The people we work with have a much bigger impact or a much bigger influence on the impact than what we do. And a typical evaluation looks at those three things where the project has got or program has high control and makes a relationship between where we've got impacts. But everything on the left of that line, the project has more control than the participants, and everything on the right of the line, the participants are more important. And a typical evaluation focuses there on the left of the line, and it's kind of easier and safer to work in that zone. And outcome harvesting focuses there on the outcomes, which is on the right of the line. And it's why we have to engage a lot with participants, because it's where they've got all the control, and tries to make a relationship between outcomes and stuff that happens in our zone of sphere of control. And rather than focusing on impacts, we tend to focus on outcomes. And finally, the diagram I showed you about reverse logic, here's a different version of it. How an outcome harvest works. First, think of the people the project works with, how they think, relate, act, make rules. Is there something different about that? And the key outcomes there. And that's the center of an outcome harvest right there. And then you say, which of those, and it's the key outcomes that change the system. So you're trying to figure out what the significance of the outcome is, and then what are the key outcomes. But when you harvest outcomes, you're going to harvest them all, and you'll figure out later on which ones are more significant than others. And you may well harvest some stories or some other data about system change. Literacy rates have gone up, mortality's gone down. That is significant for an immunization project. And then these other two circles, there's the project strategies. How much is the project strategy related to the contributed to outcomes? That's a key question in an outcome harvest. And it may be a key question, how much is it about the change agent that means that they do good, their strategies are appropriate behavior change strategies. And that's what in outcome mapping is called organizational practice. So the wiggly, and it's deliberately wiggly because an evaluation isn't a straight line thing. The wiggly red line is what an evaluation is an outcome harvest evaluation is all about. And you may not cover, in one harvest, you may not cover all three aspects of that line, but you will always collect outcomes, and you may look forward to say what the outcomes contributed, or you may look back and say which strategies contributed to the outcomes. But that's an outcome harvest. And you accept that the whole thing, the kind of blurry bit, is the context. The context affects everything in that in the rest of the diagram. And just to highlight, that's often those two blue arrows are often the keys of an outcome harvest. And again, just to cement in what we're talking about here, this is a real project document from a mental health project in Afghanistan. And here in the red circle is a typical project output. And if you read what's in there, you will all have seen this pre-test, post-test stuff, that education, etc. And me as an outcome harvester, when I see that, I say, guys, this is telling me nothing about the mental health system of Afghanistan. But in this same document, when I read this at the bottom, 100% of targeted Shura structures included mental health issues in their meeting agenda. Shura is in India it would be called panchayat. Shura is the smallest level of local government. So they are kind of at a village level. It's a village government system. And now they're all talking about mental health at a village level. And you say, what contributed to that? And look at that. In their activities, in their plans, they were planning to encourage Shura and you say, guys, this is where it's at. This is what will contribute to system change for in mental health for the people of Afghanistan. So that's what an outcome harvester gets excited about, that kind of stuff. Other people have changed behavior. So as my summary, outcome harvesting is a structured way to define where and how to look for outcomes, a structured way to collect those outcomes. I should have also had a structured or a system to verify them, a way to analyze and interpret them individually and together. So you do both. And it's in the design is how do we use this information to answer questions about system function. So that's a summary of outcome harvesting. And it's all done with, it's all based on observable changes in human actors as primary data. And I underline that, observable changes in human actors. Enter Michelle, and just tell me when I need to click on through slides.
Will do. Thank you, Jeph. And I would have to say that I love outcome harvesting. I really love it. However, like all approaches, it has its strengths and limitations, right? So it's very important to be clear around what those are. Jeph has already talked about a few of the strengths. It's wonderful in complex contexts and emergent, evolving programs, because those are spaces where you really cannot predict what your futures will be. OH has the potential for high and empowering participation, depending, of course, on how you use it. And the definition of an outcome that's used in OH, a very definition of an outcome as an observable change in behavior is really powerful. It strengthens the rigor of the evaluation, and it also tends to help people like program implementers and participants conceptualize social change in new and ways. So that definition of an outcome is really powerful. At the same time, OH has its limitations, of course. One of them is that OH can only capture the outcomes that the informants or the participants in your evaluation know about and choose to talk about. So there can be limiting factors there. It is time and skill intensive, which I think is important to mention because the logic of outcome harvesting is so elegantly simple that sometimes it leads to the conclusion that anyone can do it without any preparation at all, which is not quite the case. It does require some time and skill development to do it well. OH provides useful information on how the change, how the outcome happens, but it's limited, right? It may not be as much information as you need in terms of how change happens. And that definition outcome as observable change in behavior, while so powerful and so important, can also be really limiting in programs where internal, non-observable changes that are happening inside of people matter, right? So we're going to talk a bit about that dilemma and what some of us have been doing about it. I want to check Sonal's. Jeph, let's just pick up Sonal's question. Well, yeah.
I can't get to the chat, so Nick, could you read it out?
Yeah, it just seems timely. Let's go for it. Go ahead, Nick.
Absolutely. So while harvesting outcomes, you may find a change has not been attributed or partially contributed to the project. In that case, so sorry, do we also explore how other than project has contributed to these changes? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Do you want to answer that, Michelle, or shall I?
Happy to. Hopefully we have the same answer. Let's find out. There is, and Sonal, interested to hear what you have to say about this too, but I would say There is a practice in that is officially considered optional, but in my experience, it's almost always essential to look at the contributions of other actors and factors, right, in addition to the project that's being implemented. Yeah, officially optional, but I have yet program I felt it was safe to skip that, taking into account the actions of other actors. Does anybody else have
Yeah,
a different take on that?
it's I'm happy with that.
Okay.
So shall we can come back to that in our discussion.
All
Shall
right.
we, next slide, Michelle?
Yeah, let's jump to the next slide. Outcome harvesting plus attitude change is essentially an adaptation of outcome harvesting that allows us to include attitude change where it's needed, but without compromising the behavior-centered of the OH approach. And for purposes of this webinar, it's also an example of bricolage. It's an adaptation that I think 7 years now, together with some teams of amazing people such as Jeph Mathias. So we're going to talk a little bit about that process of OH plus AC adaptation, why we do it, and how, as an example of bricolage. Next slide, please. Before we get too far into this conversation, I think I need to tell you how we are defining attitude change. For the of the outcome harvesting, I would say attitude change is a non-observable change that's happening inside a person, right? Contrasted with the observable changes in behavior and action that are external. And those non-observable internal changes include many different aspects. It can involve opinions, emotions, perceptions, values, assumptions, worldview. It is a very broad catch-all term in the way that we use it. However, we're not alone in using it that way. It's actually borrowed from social psychology, where it is used to study the interrelationships between attitudes and behavior, which we are also doing in OH plus AC. So we'll jump to the next slide, Jeph. Just to talk a little bit about why we do this, why sometimes we add attitude change data into outcome harvesting. One key factor is that we do this in programs where internal non-observable change inside a person is essential to the program results. Conceptually, helps to think a bit about this familiar systems change view of a system as an iceberg, right? A complex adaptive iceberg in which we can see clearly above the waterline human happenings and some of the underlying behavior patterns that are creating those human events and human happenings. But what we can't see below the surface of the water are the attitudes that are driving those behaviors, or what systems change theorists often call the mindsets, meaning exactly the same thing. With the point being that systems change view helps us to recall and understand that, oh yes, often the attitude or the mindset that is the most place to intervene to begin to shift a system. And some of our programs, many of our programs follow that logic, particularly in peace building, in gender work, and in working with faith-based. Some of the expertise represented by the three colleagues in the room. For example, early days of OH plus AC, I was working on an interreligious peace building project evaluation in Iraq, in which there were so many exciting kinds of behavior change. People from different faith groups in a post-conflict setting were coming together and interacting and cooperating in new ways that for a very long time. But when I talked to the participants and the change agents on the ground, what they really wanted to talk about were the internal changes. And I remember very clearly talking to one of the women leaders who'd been convening other women interfaith groups, and she said, "It is a miracle that I was able to bring these women from all these different faith groups together to cooperate. And it happened because I was able to gain their trust and because they were willing to set aside what she called their trust in order to become open to meeting new people." She was very focused on those attitude changes and clearly understood that in the change that she was experiencing, it was attitudes and mindsets that were driving the process. And that is often the case. Also, next slide, please. We also often integrate attitude change into OH. It matters to our colleagues, to the stakeholders who are the program implementers or social actors participating in the program on the ground. Including attitude change is one key way of broadening our understanding of what makes for valid knowledge in an evaluation setting, multicultural validity. Really, many of the world cultures tend to understand social change as a process that proceeds from the inside out. Right. So if we start talking to them about evaluation approaches that include behavior change, external change only, very often will tell us something here is. Interestingly, I think that often the cultures of organizations or professional sectors matter. Well, I encounter this a lot when working with faith actors. Right? In early days of using OH, I remember working closely with a faith-based organization called Peace Catalyst International and talking to one of the colleagues there and telling her that we were going to embark on this interesting evaluation approach around changes in behavior. And she looked at me very suspiciously, honestly, kind of looked at me like I had three heads. She said, "But come on, Michelle, I know that you understand this program is about transformation." Right? And she was right, right? That was how the implementers and participants experienced that program. So going in with an evaluation approach that looked only at behavior and not at attitude would not have been relevant or useful for people on the ground. Next slide, please, Jeph, while I take a little drink. Just a few other real world examples of why this matters more than we often think. One of those reasons is that attitude change can be unintended in exactly the same way that behavior change can be unintended. right? So those unintended results often can take the form of attitude change. And I remember very closely one tier fund interfaith peace project in Egypt, in which there was a multi-faith youth cohort working together on interfaith peace building issues. And one of the participants experienced so much acceptance and unity within the multi-faith project cohort. It was such a transformative experience for him inside that cohort that he began to find it really difficult and depressing to return to everyday life. He started having struggles in his everyday life because it did not meet the standard of what he had learned was possible. And an unintended type of attitude change that when it came to light during the course of the OH plus AC evaluation was helpful to the program implementers. Once they realized it was happening, then they were able to begin to start planning, checking first to see, is this happening to more just this one? And yes, it was happening to others as well. So they began to make some adjustments to include more support, real world re-entry and navigation in their project design. Also, next slide, Jeph. This matters because often our assumptions about attitude change are incorrect, right? Sometimes we're kind of aware that an attitude change is happening, so we assume what it is. Jeph, can you go back 2 clicks? Thank you. And this is really important. A very recent example of this came from a US-based program working to reduce polarization among conservative faith groups. And as expected, the participants did experience attitude changes about how they relate to people with different political positions. However, program planners and implementers had assumed, right, that what would happen is that the participants would develop a more favorable view of the other, right? They would change their way of viewing other people who they disagreed with. And in fact, for the most part, that is not what was happening. What was happening is that the project participants were changing their views of themselves. They were actually reinterpreting who they were and who they wanted to be in that context, and reinterpreting themselves as people with higher capacity, acceptance, and tolerance towards people with whom they disagreed. And that correction of that erroneous assumption, right, that clarification of what the attitude change was that was actually taking place, aspect informing design for the next phase of the program, right? You program differently when you clearly understand attitude changes that are taking place. Next click, Jeph. Last little vignette on why this matters so much. Also because behavior change patterns may have attitudinal drivers that we don't expect. And I'm thinking here of a multi-country leadership program for religious women in Africa, in which most of the participants did, in fact, develop new and different leadership behaviors. A lot of behavior change outcomes, right? And the data showed that those changes in leadership behavior were most strong or to 2 different types of attitude change, right? confidence. And secondly, according to the women who experienced it, secondly, the other important attitudinal change driver was having new kinds of spiritual experiences, or in their words, receiving new spiritual guidance. And that new spiritual guidance, in the absence of good data, could be very easily missed, right, by evaluators going in with a secular mindset. And interestingly, it really doesn't matter what you believe about the nature of spiritual guidance, because it's important in the change for the women participating in the program, right, is very clearly evident strongly in the data. So all of those are kind of nuanced examples of why we add attitude change data into outcome harvesting. That is a good question, Nazir. I'm going to save it a little bit because it'll be easier to answer in about 5 minutes, but it's a really good question. Jeph, let's hop over to the next slide. And we're going to talk a little bit in brief about the how, right? We talked about why we add attitude change, and we'll talk now a little bit about how. The first point that I really want to emphasize is that while there are possibilities and different ways to add attitude change into outcome harvesting, OH plus C in particular does it in a way that upholds all of the OH core principles, including the behavior-centered definition of an outcome, right? So the way that we do that is by taking care to not change the definition of an outcome one bit, right? There is often some terminology confusion that can result, and therefore we switch up the terms a little bit and we stop talking about outcomes and we call them behavior changes. Right? So there's no doubt about what an outcome is. We start calling the outcomes behavior changes, and that's why you in Jeff's 6-step slides a few minutes ago. At the same time, we also emphasize that attitude changes, while incredibly important, are not considered outcomes. They are additional components within the data set, additional important information. The behavior changes that are the outcomes and that remain the backbone, the whole data collection and analysis process. Next slide. Just a reminder, of course, that there are 6 steps of outcome harvesting, and the addition of attitude change makes a difference in every single one of those steps. And to talk about all of it right now, I'm going to focus in on the 2 steps where it makes the most dramatic difference. So, hopping to the next slide, Jeph, one of those areas in which, or those points in the OH process in which the addition of attitude change makes the most difference is in step 2 and 3, when you're identifying and drafting outcome statements, or what we call behavior change statements, and then when you're in the process of refining behavior change statements. I often think of these 2 steps together, as you see on this slide, because in my experience, they're always happening at the same time. That's not necessarily true for others, but it's typically fine. So what you see here in front of you are the 3 sort of core requirements of the data that you collect to create a mainstream outcome statement in outcome harvesting: the description of the behavior change, the contribution of the program, and the significance of the change. Why does it matter within the context and in relation to the theory of change? There are other optional and very important elements you can add in, as Sonal pointed out, like contribution of other actors and facts, but for the sake of illustration, we're here to the basics. What's different in OH plus AC, next slide, please, is that we add a fourth component, right? Typically, if we're not, we literally put it in the far right column, as you would see here in front of you, but you could do the same thing if you were working to harvest outcomes in a database. It is adding qualitative information about an attitude change that is related to behavior change, part of the same outcome statement, either as a cause or an effect, and exploring whose attitude changed, in what way, and when did that occur in the program cycle. Always putting a priority on having that attitude change verified directly by the person who experienced it at some point during the process, because it is internal. You can't observe it. You need to hear it from the person who experienced it or the group who experienced it. But nonetheless, so putting in attitude change as a fourth essential component in OH data collection makes a difference in steps 2 and 3. And then we will jump quickly over to step 5, analysis, because having that attitude change data allows you to do some really interesting things in the analysis phase of OH. Of course, as a basic step, when you have attitude change data, you will categorize or code it in the same way that you do the behavior changes, right? You will come up with attitude change categories as well, and that in and of itself is really helpful to the analysis. Building on that, to take some additional, more complicated steps, there are ways that you can explore and analyze where the behavior changes and the attitude changes correlate, right? So where you have a behavior change that has occurred with great frequency within the program, you can then explore, oh, what attitude changes were related to that behavior change? What attitudes might have been driving that behavior change, or what attitude changes might have been catalyzed by that change in behavior? And that is what you see in the example before you. This example refers to the same gender-focused leadership program, multi-country in Africa, that I mentioned a few moments ago. And you can see here what the results correlation analysis look like, in that behavior changes across the top. The new or changed leadership behavior, which was the most frequently observed behavior change, strongly with an attitude change that is an increase in confidence or courage, and then secondarily with the attitude change around new spiritual guidance. Opens up all kinds of new and interesting ways of understanding how change is happening within. And one more slide, Jeph. Additionally, for those who are in habit of creating BC or outcome chain diagrams to show how often in a process of change, one outcome leads to another, leads to another, and visualizing them in this way can help you really examine in depth the process of how a particularly significant outcome achieved. You can easily add attitude change into those process diagrams as well. So in this example, one color represents behavior change, another color represents attitude change, and that behavior change has influenced attitude change, which in turn influenced further behavior change, which in this case resulted in some really exciting legislation passed to protect the human rights of Uyghurs in China. So those are just a couple examples of what that attitude change data can do for you in the analysis phase. With that, I'm going to pause and jump on to just one wrap-up slide. We will not go in depth on this right now, but I just want to flag for you that if you're interested in going deeper on the OH plus AC adaptation, here are some ways that you can do it. You can download our guide, you can request updates, you can share your experiences. So if that's of interest to you later on when you receive these slides, circle back to this one and click on the links, and we'll be there to engage with you. I'm definitely seeing Nazir's great question in the chat window, but I'm not sure if we should tackle it now or tackle it in the Q&A. Jeph, what are your thoughts?
Let's just keep that on ice, Nazir, and we'll tackle it in the Q&A. We're just going to quickly flick through the 3 other examples of bricolage, which will be quite quick. Are there, I can't see the chat windows. Are there other questions in the chat? Maybe not. Okay.
Yes, there's one more.
One more. Okay, we'll keep that on hold as well. We'll do the chat at the end. So very quickly, OH with RE, and this is a visualization of how RE's realist evaluation sees the world. On the surface, as an empirical level, the observable, what OH would say, observable changes. Where that iceberg moves is what, in this metaphor, is what outcome harvest gathers. We're watching the iceberg float across the sea. Realist evaluation says, let's dive into the depth. We know that beneath the stuff on the surface, there's what, in the terminology of outcome harvesting, an actual and a real. There are real forces, there are real causes, there are real underpinnings to why icebergs move the way they do, why people behave the way they do. And outcome harvesting wants to dive in, realist evaluation wants to dive into those depths and find them. The second slide on it, this is how realist evaluation, and this comes from Jill Westhorpe's ideas, but the idea originally is Roy Busker, the English philosopher, that the overt implementation and the overt context and the overt program activities you would gather in an outcome harvest, but then and you may gather this stuff, opportunities, resources to enact those decisions. But what realist evaluation does that, outcome harvesting then says that's the project outcomes. Those forces are going to push the iceberg around, and you gather what the direction it moves in. Outcome realist evaluation says, actually, hang on. Let's dive in here, and let's ask some of the questions about culture, gender, resources, history, reasoning, choices. You may even think these sound a little bit like the attitudes Michelle has been talking about, but let's think about all those things. And let's dive deeper still even into the water itself and think about all this stuff, politics, economics. Is the place stable? Is there violence? What's the geography like? All that kind of contextual stuff. That's all pushing on the iceberg under the water as well. And only after that will we come back to the surface and say, okay, given the person was in this context with these beliefs, what opportunities and resources did they use to enact their decision? And then what did they do after that? So that very quickly, there's a whole webinar, it is recorded, with Jill Westhorpe talking about outcome harvesting and realist evaluation together. So I'm not going any deeper than that, but the idea that Michelle introduced, that the how is often not dealt really deeply with by outcome harvesting. Realist evaluation, I would say, is a very deep way of looking at the how. An interesting correlation with Michelle. Somewhere in all that stuff below the surface, certainly our attitudes. realist evaluation says there's more stuff as well. That's all I'll say about that, and I'll hand over to you. Oh, sorry. And Roy Basker's idea would be there's an empirical, there's an actual, he calls it layered, I call it nested. Empirical is nested and actual, and real covers everything, all the empirical and actual and other stuff as well. Over to you, Michelle, about bricolaging OH with MSC.
Okay. There are actually quite a number of ways to bricolage OH with most significant change. They're really very complementary approaches. So this is just one very simple example. Using most significant change to inspire alternative ways of doing outcome significance harvesting, right? Ranking the significance of outcomes in OH can be a really powerful part of the analysis process, right? It's best done in a participatory way, but it requires a significant amount of time and bandwidth, you know, for our team of program implementers in order to do that right. And sometimes, as in the bridge building program that I'm currently evaluating in the US, that level of team bandwidth to take on the task, the significance of every single outcome in their data set isn't there. So in the case of this particular project, we opted to draw on most significant change as a way to simplify the process, right? Instead of asking them to rank the significance of every outcome in their data set, we just drew on most significant change and asked them to choose one. Tell us which of the outcomes in your data set you think is the most significant. Very simple, but that made it feasible enough to get the ranking done. And interestingly, most significant change typically also involves dialogue between what significance means to them. You know, after they pick a particular story as highly significant, the next step then is to discuss why. What does that mean? And what does that reveal about how we understand our programming? And I believe we are going to have a chance to do that in the current bridge building project that I'm evaluating. We enter the sense making process to talk with the implementers and ask and explore. Remember when you ranked that one outcome as the most significant? Tell us more. Tell us why. And let's exchange some different ways of understanding what significance means in this context. So interestingly, most significant change has really added both feasibility and a fresh lens on learning to this particular OH plus AC process. And back to Jeph.
And finally, just throwing an idea at you, we seem to be thinking of bricolage as meshing different ideas together to produce something. I wanted to say, what if we're not about meshing the ideas, we're about bricolaging our process. So I've just pulled a definition of bricolage off the net, actually. But look at the bottom one, something constructed or created from a diverse range of things. And we're thinking of the diverse range of things as various different methodologies. But what if the diverse range of things is actually experts by experience in the context? This is 3 kids in Kenya and an outcome harvest I did. And on the left are 2 young women, one of whom was a sex worker, is now an outcome harvester, and runs a little stall. And the other was a young woman, very similar like that as a program participant. And there they are in this beautiful tender slide, understanding each other in a way I couldn't speak to or understand the context. And on the right is a young man who lives in this in the street in a tiny little gap. And I would say he's got some policy statements written up on his wall there. But he's an expert by experience in a way I can't do. And I did an outcome harvest with them. There they are on the right. Not a great slide, but beautiful content. They're doing a system map using collage and cutting out, and they're designing the harvest there, and then very participatory process. And on the right, these guys actually were my co-harvesters. So fantastic to work with them. And I would say participation is more significant to me than any other methodology. And here's some women in Afghanistan. These are the ones who drew that diagram I showed you of outcomes very early on. And I had a participatory outcome harvest with, including women in Afghanistan in 2023, when the Taliban said women couldn't work. And it was fantastic. And they could talk to people I couldn't talk to, and they could understand things I could never understand in Afghanistan. It was absolutely wonderful to work with them. And participatory, this is part of our data set that is written in Dari, and they've coded it, and the green part there is coded, and then people who, bilingual people translated. So my code's on the right in English I could understand, but that's, and I would say in terms of that definition of bricolage, using things available to create something new, this kind of evaluation is something new. It's not an outcome harvest like anything defined in Ricardo's book. So I just want to throw that at you as an idea of bricolage. And I'm going to escape. Oh, sorry, before I do. Now it's your turn, and next, we'll just do this as a plenary discussion. But what we thought would be a nice discussion point, we plan to do breakout rooms, but we don't have to. We'll just do it in plenary. From all that, what do you think OH adds to your practice? And where do you feel a need to reconstruct it from the diverse things available to you? And that might be methodologies, it might be resources, it might be people, whatever. Let's just have a little discussion. And I'm going to escape that and stop screen sharing. And we're cool, we've all got our lovely faces on there. So if anyone's got a question or comment, and you can see that I'm nicely sitting in afternoon sun in New Zealand. Got lots of things in the chat there. We'll start with Nazir. Nazir, does OH provide any guidance on sampling approach to follow? Michelle, would you like to answer that one?
Yes, and then you can add. There really is not approach in the same sense as there might be if you were undertaking a quantitative study. It is really a question of who and where are the sources of knowledge about change, and what do you need to pursue them? So I have a feeling justice though. Jeph, do you want to add to it?
I'm probably going to say the same thing as you in different words. Nazir, formally, outcome harvesting is method neutral. It's not saying what method you should use to collect the outcomes. It's just saying what you should collect is behavior change. Your question, does it provide guidance? It does provide guidance without rules. So it says it guides in terms of saying to engage with participants is a strong guidance point, but also to engage with any formal written data, statistics, hospital records, those kind of things. But it doesn't, and I would say your word is exactly it. It provides guidance rather than rules on how to do it. What it's focused on is what you should be collecting, which is changes of behaviour. And hopefully we can have more discussion about this in Sri Lanka when we're sitting on the beach, Nazir. In the meantime, Rachel, I'll just ask you to unmute yourself, and you can just summarise your question and ask it to Michelle.
Yeah, sure. I think just want to ask, like, when we conduct attitude change and when you gather the actors, but some may already be they already change the attitude in the way that you want to see, but some are maybe still resistant. So how do you facilitate the kind of discussions that is, how to say, there's like people can accept it, and although even for those who are still resistant to the change, and how do you bring it up in a way that is that people won't shut down? And then some of this, it could be sensitive, like you want to see the actor change in terms of the way they are more acceptance, let's say, but they might not be there yet. So, and you don't want to document it in a way that, because it could be sensitive. I'm not sure how to yeah, bring it up, but it's just, how do you bring in the whole approach in a participatory manner? Yeah.
Yeah, Rachel, that incredibly sensitive, right? So actually, you're already doing the first thing that's important, which is just simply to recognize how sensitive it can be, and to recognize that, okay, we're going to have to additional skills to this process that might not have been needed in a main outcome, right? So just some additional skills and practices around keeping people and their data safe when they're talking about highly personal types of change. And it can affect every detail of the process, and there's not always one right answer. It depends a lot on the context. I think I would say two things. One is, one of the big that we help to work around the sensitivity of the attitude change in the early phases of the process is we don't really typically, again, OH plus AC, like OH is kind of method neutral. So there are many ways to, we don't ask people about attitude change. We ask them what has changed, right? What kinds of changes have you observed, experienced, right? And that typically results in a story, which usually includes a mixture of behavior change and attitude change at whatever level the person is comfortable talking about it, right? And you follow it up from there, right, to better identify and fully unpack the behavior changes and the attitude changes and how they relate. But it's typically an indirect approach. So that helps a lot in the early stages. And then I would say, if it's of interest, there's a lot more kind of detailed, nuanced thoughts on how to manage the sensitivity of the process in the OH plus AC guide as well, which can be downloaded. Does that help?
Yes, thanks.
Okay. Jeph, can't hear you.
Sorry. Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, Rachel. Another one for you from the ever questioning Nazir. We love it, Nazir. Nazir asks, how difficult stroke easy is it to verify the scale and significance of attitude changes that may be linked to the project?
That's also a great question, and it's like 3 questions in one. One aspect of that, verification, and as I mentioned, we really try in OH plus AC to make sure that in some form or other, we are hearing about attitude changes from the person or group who experienced it, right? Because it's an internal process. No one else who's observing knows for sure on inside of the person. So that's an important part. At the time, linking the attitude changes to the behavior changes as part of the outcome or behavior change statement is a strong form of trying. When you see an attitude change claim, right, it's a lot easier to believe when you see behavior changes that correspond to that attitude change. So that's an important part of how the attitude change data and behavior change data work together. When it comes to significance, we actually don't usually try to assess the significance of the attitude change directly. We just try to assess the significance of the behavior change statement of which it's a part. So significance analysis is focused more on the behavior change than on the attitude change. And scale challenge for attitude change just as it is for behavior change when it's qualitative, right? There are some ways to work it within the quality process, but if you really need to know on a large scale and rigorously the scale at which a change has happened, sometimes it's a good idea to think about a mixed methods approach that adds in a quantitative follow-up at the end. So that was a lot of things that I just said. Hopefully it added clarity rather than confusion. I'm looking at Jeph.
Thank you,
I'm not so
Michelle.
sure.
Nazir, a thumbs up. And just to add to that, I definitely recommend watching the last webinar by Jill Westhorpe. In realist evaluation, the internal changes, the terminology is mechanism, what happens inside someone, what's triggered inside them, and that would be an umbrella. Attitude change would come in there. And realist evaluation does have a whole lot of different ways of finding what mechanisms are and looking for patterns of mechanism. This is a common pattern of the internal changes among women sex workers in Uganda that then led to a policy change down somewhere else. So do watch that. And this idea of bricolage, there are obviously going to be overlaps, and there's some things in realist evaluation, some things in what Michelle just said, which overlap really nicely. Great. Any more questions? And you can just unmute yourself and ask the question out loud as if we're in a group setting. Nazir, thank you.
Yeah,
Unmute
very
yourself.
quickly, I know we are very much end of the webinar. When we make inferences, let's say I just saw the metrics you put there, Michelle, where you N, like the 48 for leadership change, or let's say, so how do we draw inferences? Because if we are collecting data from individuals, if 30% of, let's say, the people who we interviewed experienced a change in leadership or maybe in some kind of attitude, can we say something, that the project contributed to changing the leadership capacities or capabilities of those who were part of the program? And can that be generalized for the whole program or the whole project in a way? Or do we say, okay, that was only for that particular group who we interviewed? Like, how do we present the effectiveness of the project, when we are communicating about the influence as a whole?
Part of that great question definitely relates to all the debate that exists, like justifiably, around quantifying qualitative data, because it can be useful to do so, and yet it's not the same. It's not the same process of meaning out of it. So we would certainly, in quantifying OH or OH plus AC qualitative data, look a lot more at the specific numbers. What are the overarching patterns and trajectories telling you? Not so much focus on the specific details of the numbers. And I think differences about across the breadth of the program, you'd really need to look at who was changed. Like if you have very, very frequent type of behavior change or attitude change, the frequency of it is indication that it might be broad, but you also need to look at who is experiencing the change. Does it represent people from all different spaces and backgrounds and aspects of the community in question, or is it people who are within a particular niche of shared experience? And that can tell you something about change might be stretching as well. Jeph, anything to add to that from your experience?
No, I think, well, there'll be lots to add, but let's leave it to Sri Lanka. We've got to time. Firstly, thank you to all 4 of our participants, Nazir, Rachel, Sonal, and Muhammad Ali bin Yoder. Thank you for coming. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for your questions. Also, thank you for providing ideas for all the people who are going to watch this video. We're going to end now and ask you guys to log out, and not just Michelle and Nick, if you just stay on for 5 minutes and we'll do a little debrief. Thank you very much, and see you all in Sri Lanka.